Hello, my name is Bill Lord. I'm an audiobook narrator. And on the other side of the screen is David Stever, who is an incredible author, writes some great mysteries and thrillers. And we're going to chat a little bit about a couple of books that we have worked on together that David has written and I have narrated, Toxic Blonde, and prior to that, Auburn Ride. And these are, why don't you say it, Dave? The Johnny Delarosa,
And it's a thriller, it's a noir for the 21st century.
the thriller series.
Yes.
And I'm going to, what we're going to do here is just sort of peel back the layers of the onion a little bit and talk about how we approach our side of the project. Some of the things that David does when he writes, some of the things I do when I read, and just ask each other a series of questions, maybe 4 or 5 questions, and let people take a look on the inside, so to speak.
Yeah, sounds great. I'm looking forward to it.
All right. So I know one of the biggest challenges that I face as a narrator is voicing females authentically.
Uh-huh.
I hate going into stereotypes um, um, but it's really a challenge to give characters an honest, authentic voice when I'm not a female. That's my struggle, so to speak. And I'm wondering, do you struggle with writing female characters as well?
Well, I try to be, I really give that a lot of thought. And I certainly don't want any of the female characters, like you said, to be stereotypical or cliche in any way.
Right.
Um, I think the female characters in my books are smart people. Um, there's some attitudes from some of the male characters that are misogynistic a little bit or politically incorrect, but I try to make the females, I don't want them to be cliche at all, and I want to give them their own voice. And of course, if anyone's familiar with the series, they know that the lead female in the books is the femme fatale, and she's the villain. So they're very smart people, and they're very um, cunning and smart. So I really try to do that. I don't want them to be cliche at all. So I spend a lot of time making sure what they say does not come off as a stereotype. So
Right. As a victim of the misogyny that some of the other characters are
yeah,
displaying.
you said it better than I did. Yes.
So what can I answer for you, Dave?
Well, let's see, sort of the same thing. What's your process when taking on a new project? Do you um, read the entire book first, then go back, make notes, chapter by chapter, character outlines, things like that?
I kind of do that all at once. I'm a big believer in reading the book start to finish before I narrate. Um, and during that process, I'm making notes. I'm making, we've talked about this before. To me, every chapter is like the scene in a movie.
Mm-hmm.
And, every scene, every chapter is progressing the story, further down towards the final resolution to the big, you know, climactic end, as it were.
Right.
So every chapter has a purpose in moving that story forward. So those are the notes that I'm making. This is what was accomplished in this chapter. These were the emotional conflicts in this chapter. And, now that we've worked together on a couple of projects, you've started actually providing some of that information,
Mm-hmm.
which is fantastic. Um, um, because we only have maybe a couple days to prep a book. So any notes that we get on characters or scene development, it's really, really helpful. But most authors don't do that. So we have to call that out. Um, and there was one other point I wanted to make, and now I've forgotten because because
We'll circle back to it. That's right. Well, yeah, here we'll toast Johnny and Mike and the gang
there
with
you
a
go,
little,
there you go.
they're big fans of bourbon in the books and other things to drink.
Oh, wow, I know the other thing I was going to say. Um, a lot of times there's a red herring. There's a character who might pop up as what you don't expect that character to pop up in as later in the book. Um, and if you don't know that this twist is coming, you don't know how to deliver it in the first place.
Yes.
I had one book that one guy was two characters, and he turned out to be the bad guy in the whole thing, even though he was just such a lovable guy through the whole book. And then at the end, you'd find out he was a bad guy. If if I wasn't aware of all of that before I started narrating the book, I couldn't have ever pulled it off. Like I
Right.
couldn't do the same voice for the same guy, even though it was two people, because that would have given it away.
Right. Right.
So I had to play a different attitude for each side of his personality. So it's things like that that make it very important to me to read through the entire book and make all of these notes and be able to tell the story
Right.
well.
Yep.
So
Interesting.
so I have to say that the one of the most difficult scenes I had in narrating Toxic Blonde was that torture scene. Oh my God. It was I I want to say it was brutal, but I want to offer a caveat to that. Like the words themselves were not overly descriptive. You know,
Mhm.
it wasn't brutal in that sense, but you knew in the back of your mind that he was going through hell and back to hell again. And it you also have a lot of scenes that really get into like little love interests and um, distrust between certain characters. There's a lot of emotional content in what you write.
Mhm.
And so my question to you is, can an author be a great author if they can't feel those emotions strongly within themselves?
Okay, now you're asking hard questions.
Right
Uh,
back at you, brother.
yeah, I think any writer has to tap into their own emotions of things that they've experienced in their life, um, and what they felt at the time. We all experience emotion on day to day, just going through everything that happens to you in life. I'm not a young guy anymore, so I've experienced a lot of things that maybe a younger writer might not have experienced. So maybe that lens helps me a little bit in that way. So I've experienced some of those emotions and try to tap into that. Maybe the same way an actor would tap into that, portraying a character, emotion that he felt in life. He can use that in a character, and I think a writer can kind of do the same thing. Um, the scene in Toxic Blonde, we can talk about that in depth too if you want. Um, that was that. Yeah, of course, I've never experienced what Johnny Delarosa goes through in that scene, so hopefully it plays out well on the page. So I hope it does.
I think it did. I think what I was struggling to find the words for a moment ago is that it wasn't overly graphic,
Right.
right?
Exactly.
But you sure knew what was going on,
Yeah.
and it was beautifully written
Oh,
and
thank you.
um, so what can I answer for you again?
Well, I want to go back to the first question in your process. Um, you go through the book, read it, start the recording, and what you said is each chapter is sort of a scene, go by scene, and that's the way I write it. And when I lay these out and outline them, and I do them chapter by chapter, which is sort of again scene by scene. Um, do you record that chapter, then go back, listen, edit if you need, or will you record a large portion of the book, then go back and listen and edit if you need to?
So this gets into one of the hardest parts of the narrator's job, which is self-directing. Everybody dreams of working for one of the big publishers and having a director sitting on the other side of the glass, and if that director hears you sort of getting derailed or not being fully engaged, they'll stop you and say, hey, let's back this up a little bit. Self-directing, you don't have that luxury, so you always have this little voice in the back of your mind Well, I don't even want to say that because if you start listening to that voice, it takes you out of the scene. But let's put it this way. If I'm narrating and suddenly I start thinking about a ham sandwich, you know, it's time to get up and go make a ham sandwich,
Yeah.
you know, because if that's what you're thinking about when you're trying to bring characters to life, then you will fail. It's just not going to happen. So when I find myself getting a little out of the moment, I'll get out of the booth, just
Okay.
for a little bit. But to fully answer your question, I read and read and read and read and read. I'll read for 4 or 5 hours, with little breaks in between. Sometimes I'll read as long as 6 hours a day.
Mhm.
Um, the whole time, sort of self-directing, but just getting fully engrossed in the story and the characters, and just telling the story like I'm sitting around the campfire. You know, and when the book is done, that's when I'll go back and start, going through the proofing process.
Okay.
So I'll add something else here. There's a form of recording called punch and roll or punch recording. So what happens is if I make a mistake, I'll stop. I'll move the cursor back to a good stopping point prior to the mistake, where I can make a nice natural uh, edit, so to speak. And then with the push of a button, the computer pre-rolls the audio for about 4 or 5 seconds, um, plays it back in my ear, and I'll read along with it. So if I say the Johnny Delarosa thriller soupies, oops, oh, there's a mistake. So I bring the cursor back, I hit the button, and I'll read along with it, the Johnny Delarosa thriller series. The edit's made, and I just keep going.
I see. Okay.
So when I'm finished with 30 chapters or 300, 400 pages, whatever, um, it's sort of edited. It's a good, clean file. Then I send it off to a proofer who listens for all the mistakes that I probably made. Um, when you're in the moment, you don't hear every little mistake you make, but the proofer does. They send back the corrections. You punch those back in.
Okay.
Um, it goes off to the editor for the final cleanup and mastering, and then it's ready to upload the files.
Yeah, I was kind of amazed at your process actually. When we first started this with the first book, Auburn Ride, I had no idea what your process was like. And so I didn't know whether I would be involved. Like you said, you self-direct it. And I didn't know whether I would be on standby and you call me, say, okay, I need to know what this character was thinking and or so forth. But you said to me, nope, I'm fine. I'll let you know when I'm done. So I was amazed by that and very happy with the results too, by the way.
Well, good.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. I think it's your turn to ask a question.
Okay. I like the level of detail that you put in.
Hmm.
You know, just the way you describe the environment, the people, um, what they're wearing, how they walk. There's just a lot of detail. Um, in Toxic Blonde, especially, this whole space-based solar power technology
Yes.
must have required a fair amount of research. When you're in the middle of a novel, or as you're preparing for a novel, how much time do you spend researching things like that?
Well, for that particular book, for Toxic Blonde, and there is this whole element of this technology that our villain is after, and it's space-based solar power, which is a real thing. Um, and it's capturing solar power in space from satellites, capture the sun's rays, and they can convert that into electricity. The problem is getting it back to Earth. But that's the technology that's out there. So I had to make sure I had that correct. So I did spend a fair amount of time researching that, how it works, and what the problems are with it, and what's going to happen in the future. So that required uh, a decent amount of research. Other parts of my book, my books take place in a fictional city of Port City, which gives me a lot of leeway and I have a lot of fun making up places for them to go, and streets and neighborhoods and restaurants and things like that. But for sort of prop items, I call them, like weapons that Johnny carries, um, I'll make sure I have that correct. I'll spend some time to make sure that I have the descriptions of the guns and are correct, because any gun aficionado would call me out on it if I get that wrong.
Right.
And the same thing with the cars that they drive, and make sure that's correct, and the wine that they drink, and other drinks or food in the books. Um, so I do spend some time on that kind of research, all those little detailed things that we need to put in there to make it all feel real to the
Mhm.
reader.
Well, I have to say there are a couple of wines you mentioned in that book that I was like, what the? I had to look that up.
Absolutely. Might not be real.
No, they were all real. But in fact, we started looking for it. We went down to Total Wine and it was like, I got to try that,
He has very good taste. So
Yes,
he has
yes,
very
he
good
does.
taste. Yes.
Yes, he does. So whose turn is it now?
I think it's my turn.
Okay.
Um, we we live in a very mobile society, and we can get audiobooks on our computer, on our smartphones, tablets, and all of our devices. Um, what do you see? And I know audiobook business has exploded in the past few years. What do you see for a lot of growth in the industry? What do you predict for the audiobook industry?
It's growing leaps and bounds. There was a time when an author would write a book and the audio rights were, never thought about. A lot of times in just a boilerplate contract, they'd go to the publisher and the publisher did nothing with them. These days, I think everybody is aware of the rights situation and everybody wants to retain the rights, um, because audiobooks are the fastest growing segment in the entire publishing industry. It really has exploded. I think I don't know. I read something the other day that said $1 billion part of the industry now.
Yeah.
I'd have to really go fact check that. Um, but yeah, it's just grown leaps and bounds, and it's a wonderful thing. Um, a lot of people don't have time to read these days.
Yeah.
We're all wearing many hats, both at home and at work. Um, Sometimes we have long commutes, and that's where a lot of people listen to audiobooks. They get tired of listening to the traffic and the depressing news,
Right.
or the same 350 songs on the radio, and
Right.
you know, so yeah, a lot of folks are reading audio or listening to audiobooks in the car, doing yard work, doing the laundry, vacuuming, laying in bed. It's just another form of entertainment in this mobile world that we have become such a big
Right.
part of.
I didn't give it a lot of thought when I wrote the first book. I knew that it was out there and available to me to exploit those rights. But it wasn't until a couple folks asked me, "Oh, do you have it on audio? I would love to have it on audio." So then, thank goodness, Amazon and Audible make things a little easier for the author these days to go out and get the book made or made into an audiobook. So I'm so happy that I did, because you're right, it's a whole nother, for the author and for the narrator, it's a whole nother revenue stream that's out there for us to take advantage of. So
Yeah, yeah. So I have one last question for you, and I'm
okay.
pretty sure I know the answer to this because I think we share the same affinity for this character. But who is your favorite character to write?
ah
And tell us a little bit of why.
my favorite character to write, it actually came as a surprise to me when I first started writing the Auburn Ride, and that's Katie. uh,
Yes.
She is. It starts out. The book starts out where she's somebody who had been kidnapped, and Johnny was hired to find her, and then he does, and then she sort of goes away for about 10 chapters. Then she comes back, and she is 24 years old, all American girl, comes from an affluent household, and she becomes obsessed with becoming a private investigator. So she comes back into their life begging to have a job as a private eye. And Johnny and Mike, his sort of partner, and the co-owner of the bar. They work out of a bar, and the co-owner of the bar, and they tell her there's no way you can do this, but she sort of wears them down, and they hire her on as a bartender, waitress, and researcher, and a part-time private eye. So he puts her to work a little bit. But it's really fun because she is very naive. She doesn't come from that world. She comes from this affluent world. And Johnny comes from the streets. He was a cop for 20 years, and now he's a PI. So he knows the gritty, mean streets of the city, where she has no idea. That was not her life at all. So we get that dynamic between the two of them. He's always trying to protect her in a way, and she's very naive about the way things work. She has really no street smarts about her. The way she would need is she's a private eye. So it opens up a lot of possibilities for me for fun banter between the two of them. It also has now evolved into more of a mentor-mentee relationship between the two, and also a father-daughter relationship between the two. But she gets all the good lines. She gets all the good jokes. She's always the butt of the jokes too, a lot of times. It creates a fun dynamic. I wasn't expecting that when I first started to write the book. I kind of thought she would come back in some way, but not the way that she has. And then she continues into the second book too. So it's really become really fun for me to write my character.
So 2 thoughts about Katie. First off, where we first met her in Auburn Ride
Right.
was one of the most fun scenes that I've ever recorded in my life.
Oh, great.
Getting the plastic. And I don't want to tell anymore, but it was so much fun to do that scene. But at the end, you said that you didn't know if she was coming back. At the end of Toxic Blonde, she's really rattled by some of the occurrences and the things that happen in this book, and she sort of disappears, and nobody knows if she's coming back. So will she be back in book 3?
Well, maybe I should keep that to myself. I don't know. I mean, yeah, she suffers a trauma at the end of book 2. She suffers this trauma. It all becomes real. Everything that Johnny's been trying to protect her from sort of happens.
Right.
And it becomes real for her, and she doesn't know if she can handle it. And maybe he's been right all along. This is not the business for you. This is not the world for you. And she has to take a break. So we'll see.
Well,
Sure wouldn't be any fun without her in the book, though, would it?
Well, probably not. Well, I'm really looking forward to the next installment, and the Johnny Delarosa thriller series has just been a joy to read and to perform.
Well, thank you very much. I need to congratulate you. I know you've recently become an Audible approved producer. So that speaks to you, the quality of your work and your professionalism and your dedication to the craft. So I'm lucky we're on the same team here, and you're doing my books. So I really appreciate all of your efforts and what you do for me and for the industry too.
Oh, thank you so much. That's awfully nice. But when you just tell stories and like to tell stories, which my mother has been complaining about since I was about 4, just it's what you do. So Dave, I've really enjoyed just having a little moment to share some thoughts about our process.
It's been fun, and I guess we should say that the books are Auburn Ride and Toxic Blonde. They're available on Amazon and Goodreads and other online places. And if you're a fan of audiobooks, and if you're not and you're thinking of trying it, I hope you do. Do not miss Bill Lord's performance in these audiobooks, and they're available also on Amazon and Audible too. So thank you very much for this opportunity. It was a pleasure speaking with you today.
Well, it's been my pleasure. Now, get to it. We need book 3.
Yes, it's coming. It's coming.
All right, Dave.
You're typing away hard.
All right, my friend. It's been a true pleasure. We'll talk to you soon.
Okay. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.